we are ready to go for our final session of the day. Our changing climate is giving rise to volatile and extreme weather events, including the growing threat of heat emergencies that require multi-agency responses. From an interoperability standpoint, these emergencies cover vast geographic areas and bring forth challenges such as power outages, cell phone tower disruptions, cooling station requirements, special care for vulnerable populations, and the potential for mass casualty events. In this panel, we will discover how different agencies are collaborating to ensure the safety of our communities in the face of this escalating challenge. This session's speakers will be introduced by Laura Aiken, editor of Firefighting in Canada.
Thank you, Brittany, and welcome everyone. So this session will be moderated by Ridian Lewis, who's the Associate Dean at Bedfordshire Business School in the UK. He will be joined by Superintendent Peter Suey, E-Division Intelligence Officer in the RCMP, Jamie Coots, a fire service leader, consultant, and former chief for Lesser Slave Regional Fire Service in Alberta, and Sam Griff, Deputy Chief City Manager from Plano, Texas. I'm going to hand the conversation over to Ridian. If you have any questions during the discussion, please type them in the Q&A, and I will be back at the end of the panel to facilitate the question period.
Laura, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to members of the panel and also the broader audience who are attending. Well, for me, it's this evening. For you, I know it's still the afternoon. As Laura said, my name is Ridian Lewis, and I'm going to introduce a number of questions to the panel and hopefully facilitate a conversation around the continuing issues that arise around heat emergencies. Thus far, it's been heartening to hear a number of references to what's going on in the UK, but realistically, I've been thinking about this as we've been hearing the comments made by previous speakers. The UK, by comparison to Sam's area, which is the wonderful state of Texas, and across the country of Canada, is a relatively small geographical space, which is noticed for many things, but a temperate climate. So heat emergencies within the UK take on a particular meaning, but not the same meaning as I know that you guys experience on a regular basis. So I have shared some questions with the panel before today. So I'd just like to, first of all, give them an opportunity to just talk about the heat emergencies that they've experienced in the recent past. And then we'll go into some specific questions about how these have unraveled and what have been the interoperability issues that they've faced and how they've overcome them. So in terms of just kicking us off, for no particular reason, just where you appear on the screen, I'm going to ask Sam, first of all, if you could just give us an overview of some of the things that you've experienced and effectively, what do heat emergencies mean to you?
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me on. In Texas, we're quite used to the heat, but although this year is gone down, I believe, is our 5th hottest summer ever since they've been keeping records. So to say that it was hot in Texas is like saying that a giraffe's got strep throat. It was pretty painful down here on us. We experienced, even by our standards, just multiple high 100 triple digit heat, 110, 112 day after day. So I think our infrastructure obviously is better prepared than many places, and our population, although we still saw heat stroke, heat emergencies, those same things, and obviously the toll it takes on equipment and personnel. But it was a rough summer for us, and we literally just cooled off in the last couple of weeks down into the 80s. So we're enjoying what we're considering fall right now.
I love the way you say down into the 80s. If it hits the 80s in the United Kingdom, then everything kind of stops. Just to let you know that Jamie's in Roval, Nova Scotia, and he's having a few connectivity problems. So until he can rejoin us, it's likely to just be the three of us on the panel, but hopefully he'll be with us very soon. So I'm now going to turn to Peter. So in terms of your professional and personal experiences of heat emergencies, are they following the same kind of pattern that Sam's just mentioned in terms of continual hot and ever increasing hot summers, or are you seeing something different? And if so, how is that impacting upon your environment?
Well, we'll start with 2021, which was our probably worst heat emergency ever, and where we saw significant deaths into the hundreds here in BC. But what we're seeing is it's not one area, it's not one geographical area. And, within BC, there's multiple agencies that would deal with it.
Mm.
And what do we do as a group to focus our efforts as a police agency to support the medical professions and things like that? Look at the vulnerable populations and what do we do to help them at the end of the day? As a police agency, we'll come and do the hard door knocks. We'll come ask the questions. We'll do your neighborhood checks just to ensure that, your neighbors are well. We talk about climate change. I've heard that quite a few times in the forum today. And we had the warnings this year. Obviously, the lessons that we learned in 2021 have translated into the summer that we just had, where our pre-impact communication was a lot quicker than it was before. And it was more trusted just because we had dealt with the emergency within the last couple of years. So people actually paid attention to the warnings that we put out.
Thank you. That's an interesting point, and I'd be interested in your collective views on this, because I've been watching a committee meeting that's just recently taken place at the House of Commons within the UK, and one of the issues, and it's come up a number of times in the meetings thus far, is around culture, and culture leading people's approach to, in this case, heat. A concern within the UK is that hot days good, cold days bad. And there's now a considerable piece of work that's now needed to try and educate people as to how to behave when they are facing heat emergencies, because we're just not using it. So, Peter, you mentioned that you're taking a proactive approach towards messaging towards the community. Are you starting now to see, and Sam as well, are you starting now to see there being a greater awareness of messages that are coming out from emergency response environments and potentially from local or central government around heat emergencies and the impact they can have on the individual? So I don't know who wants to come in on that first.
I would say yes, but we've had it in place for many, many years. So like when we make announcements, public announcements, that we've got cooling stations opened and where people can go because they've got to get out of the heat. A lot of people don't have air conditioning, unfortunately, or their air conditioners broke. They're elderly. I mean, we have to look at our vulnerable population, and that's who we kind of target and make sure that we get the word out through, the advocacy groups for senior citizens. And then just lots of public announcements that come out over the news media, reminding everybody to drink plenty of water, seek shade, take frequent breaks, and then to recognize the signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion and, of course, much worse, heat stroke. So it's really a multi-pronged effect, but I would say our population down here, like I said, we're used to heat. I mean, triple digit heat, 100, 101 is nothing unusual throughout the summer for us. When it starts getting into that 110, 111, 113 degrees one day this year, and it doesn't cool off even at night. And I'm talking like at midnight, you're still at 92, 93 degrees. The body doesn't catch up. So that's the importance of having plenty of places. And if it's like a holiday, we will actually open up city facilities to accommodate cooling stations, but because we got shopping malls, there's lots of businesses, there's parks and recs, there's numerous places, libraries that people can go to get out of the heat that don't really cost anything. But if we need to open up because it's closed, say July 4th holiday, then we'll open up city facilities to create cooling stations.
Thank you very much. Peter, does that resonate with your experiences, or are there things that you're now starting to put in place, given the fact that, the experience in Texas is of far greater exposure to heat?
Well, one of the best things that happened is the heat emergency hit BC 3 days after we canceled the state of emergency for COVID. So all of our resources were still stood up. We had all the health contacts.
Yeah.
We were into all the communities and things like that for messaging. So that was stood up for that. What we've seen from the lessons learned from 2021 as a group, as we're preparing for the emergencies, this has translated into more community engagement, more stakeholder engagement. And stakeholders, I'm meaning municipal governments, rural communities, NGOs, we had a lot of emergent volunteer groups come up to try and assist. So as we worked through it and identify the people that could help, it became a messaging and building relationships and networks for them to get the message out for us, because we have a very, very small part to play in a heat emergency. Our job normally, because of the amount of deaths, is, we're knocking a door and we're informing someone's relatives that, hey, someone didn't pass away, or we're waiting for a coroner. So at the end of the day, our job is to ensure that we support the agencies, get the messages out, and the vulnerable communities. Like, we have an excellent relationship with our Indigenous communities. While we're out there, we have a department liaison team, and that's all they do is they go and they check on the communities and things like that. So, we do a lot of things behind the scenes because we're always engaged with the community.
Okay. That kind of brings us into the first formal question that I've shared with you guys already, which is, again, based on your experiences within extreme heat emergencies, can you just share some of the best practice that you've developed around what I've referred to as disseminating information, so peer-to-peer across agencies, and also cascading information within your own organizations, particularly around decision making? We heard earlier about how you can plan. You don't really know how your planning is going to develop until you're faced with a particular emergency. So if you can share some of your insights into that, it would be absolutely great. So Sam, if we start with you again.
Okay. As far as the dissemination of information, again, it's somewhat multi-pronged. Each agency has its own standard operating procedures. By that, my role now is deputy city manager over public safety, but I was fire chief here in Fort Worth prior to that. So, my experiences in this area is each department has its own standard operating procedures that if this, then that. If the weather temperature gets to X above, then you start putting your extra resources on duty. You make sure you have your rehab vehicle stocked with ice water, and I mean tubs of ice water with towels floating in it, because when firefighters come out of a heated environment on a day like that, they drop much quicker. So you got to cool the body off. We have cooling vests that have water that circulates through them. But predominantly, I mean, if it's bad enough, we could activate the EOC, but we usually, for heat emergencies, it's a very small activation because it doesn't sneak up on us. I mean, we know well in advance that the high dome's building over the top of us and it's going to be extremely hot. And again, we start looking out, community paramedics look out after the known elderly population. And we just, we'll have a rendezvous first thing in the morning amongst the executive team of the city to talk about what each department's doing, because Parks and Recs plays a role, as I alluded to, so do libraries for their facilities. And then we have a thing that just generally the citizens sign up for called Code Red. And it just sends an automatic text message out to either your email account or your phone, or both, whatever you sign up for, that tells you what the high is going to be that day, what the low, and just reminds you of those common sense things that you should do for yourself, but also to watch for others. Because unfortunately, as everyone knows, once you start getting into a true heat emergency of the human body, one of the first things that happens is the mind quits making good decisions, and you get in too deep and don't realize that you're getting way too hot. So we ask, be your brother's keeper and look out for the signs and symptoms and get people cooled off as rapidly as possible.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. Peter?
Well, for me, previous to my job as intelligence, I was in charge of the operational readiness and response. So we're looking at all natural disasters and all man-made disasters. So I look at the planning for it as building a sandwich. And you know what, as I build my sandwich, I build an 80% sandwich. And whenever emergency hits, I look at what I have to put in the sandwich, what condiments and what meat do I have to put out there. But what we rely on as getting information and dissemination out is we sit on committees at the local, regional, provincial, and national level. So we can, as we build our sandwiches, we can put the pieces in that we can disseminate to our partner agencies, or gather information from our partner agencies of what they need to get out. And then we can put a sustained message from all of our agencies that have these exact same message. So consistency at the end of the day. Without that, then who is the trusted source? Because you're looking at, let's say, X they're putting out one message, then they're looking at why they're looking at a message, and then they're looking at the RCMP. You have a separate message. Before these messages get out, we make sure that all our communication people have the same information that they're going to put out. And some of the messages may be different, like Sam has said, like on what to do, water and things like that. That's not our message. Our message, get to a cooling center, there's heat coming on. But we make sure that, we mirror what they're saying. Go to this website, go to these community centers. These cooling centers will be open so that we have a consistent diet of trusted information.
Just following on from that, because I've heard a lot this afternoon about the role that technology plays within interoperability. Should you face a situation where you've potentially got failure of communications environments, the mobile towers no longer work, you don't have electricity supplies, can you tell the audience anything about the risk mechanisms that you, or the risk assessment mechanisms that you take to those type of scenarios, and then the mitigations that you may have in place should you find yourselves in those positions where you've got a breakdown in what we'd now consider, basic communications?
Again, for us, ironically, what has prepared us this past year for the extreme heat when it comes to resiliency is what happened to us in February of 2021, which I know my Canadian friends will go, that's a Tuesday here. But we experienced extreme cold temperatures. Our actual temperature outside was -6 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't the wind chill, that was the true temperature. It stayed that way for several days that we never got above 10 degrees. And we lost power in the state of Texas, really widespread. The cascade effect was enormous. So one of the things that we did is we replaced many of the emergency generators in our critical city facilities, or we put generators in ones that had never had them before. And this year we were certainly prepared to take advantage of that preparation, because once again, the Texas grid started getting overloaded, this time because of the consumption of energy to keep the air conditioners going everywhere. Some businesses voluntarily, large electric users, shut down voluntarily to protect the grid and leave us in a stable mode. But had we lost power, which fortunately we didn't have widespread outages, but having those emergency generators in your critical facilities, and again, getting that word out through multiple avenues. We take advantage of email, text messaging, city web page, local news media to let everybody know where they can go to be able to get cool. And so I think, it's sort of a belt and suspenders approach that we've taken. We certainly, like I said, are in better shape to deal with the heat, but it does have a significant impact if you have a summer like the one we just went through.
And going from one extreme to the other, where you've had such cold weather, which is atypical for yourselves, into something which you're far more used to dealing with. I know that the upper ends of the heat extremes bring their own challenges, but you kind of already articulated a way of learning on previous experience because you've had a significant amount of it. I don't know whether -6 Fahrenheit is a regular Tuesday for you, Peter, but in terms of the risk assessment and the risk mitigation that you're regularly faced with. I know British Columbia as a state is a state of extremes in itself, where you can sunbathe on the beach and then go skiing in the afternoon practically. So, how would you deal with risks and mitigations?
Well, obviously ours is all built on preparedness and mitigation strategies, and are they able to deal with the resiliency of what's going to happen here? So for us, it's to identify the vulnerable populations. So obviously seniors, the homeless. We have a large drug addicted population here. Yeah. So, we have a lot of mental health calls and mental health issues that we have to deal with. So these are the populations that we would tell our officers out through briefings, hey, these are the groups that you have to reach. You have to, go out and ask the question, hey, are you okay, or do you need help? And we can send them somewhere. All other avenues of communication have fails. That would be our responsibility at the end of the day, to identify these pieces here. For our community response officers or our community response units, it's for them to go and check on the senior centers and things like that, put the message out, hey, this is coming. Because realistically, if we had to send an alert, we could send out a first alert to every cell phone in BC. we can geofence it, we can do all that. But, you know, if we're talking a total communication breakdown, then you know what? We go to the briefings of our officers throughout all our communities. We work with our partners, our partner policing agencies, and those are the discussions that we have. Hey, we're going out, we're doing this, we're hitting these vulnerable populations that we have identified, and we're going to offer them assistance or get them somewhere where they can get cooled off, get a water, something along those lines. And the big thing that we're missing here is, you know, as we're going through this, a lot of these people that need mental health assistance, you know what, we're the first ones that are there to talk to them. And, you know, we have to go find them help at the end of the day, because maybe their people that are there to help them aren't available to them anymore if they're dealing with something else. So we find that a lot. We wear many hats when something like this comes up. And that's one of the first things. And that's the biggest thing. We have to communicate, and we have to let them know, hey, there's danger coming, and that's what we're prepping our frontline officers for.
Thank you very much for that. I'm certainly aware now, more than I was previously, of the impact of heat on mental health and those who have mental health issues, particularly around, and Sam, you mentioned it earlier, about the potential for the lack of sleep and the impact that that can have on somebody who's not suffering from mental health issues, but that's exacerbated in those people that have got an element of mental health dependency upon caregivers in order to help them to maintain just normal functions in the day, and that becomes far more a problem within a heat emergency. It's something that in the UK we're only starting now to discuss, because we've had so little experience of dealing with significant heat emergencies, particularly for a prolonged period of time. Okay, in terms of heat emergencies, we have talked around a number of different things. One thing I'm interested in is the fact that there are, within your particular realms, significant geographical areas that can be impacted by a heat emergency, which take on board both urban and rural areas. And the impact of heat emergencies can be significantly different in those particular areas. Different heat emergencies can have different knock-on effects, so it can end up ultimately with flooding or infrastructure issues, for example. So in terms of your own experiences, how have you managed to adapt your strategic and operational planning activities around those different geographical areas, particularly around things like the use of resources? And then we'll move on to things such as training. So how has heat emergencies now started to influence strategic and policy making? Peter?
Well, for us, we in Emergency Operations Center, as we prepare, we have full-time staff. That's all they do all year, is to plan for emergencies like this. So we are broken up into 4 regions in the RCMP and BC here, and we go out and we actually exercise and train our regions. We bring in the detachment commanders, we talk to them, we talk to the regional commanders, hey, if this happens, this is what's here for you. And it's their job to go back and engage with their communities and their stakeholders at the end of the day to start identifying, hey, some of the things that could happen, and get into the emergency management practices of building relationships, because without those relationships, we can't get any messages out. So, you know, if we're talking an urban area, that's for us, that's pretty simple. If it's into a rural area, we can always move officers. Like, we have a large contingent in BC of officers that we can draw on. And if it becomes a problem, we can draw nationally. If if there's a state emergency declared, we can always draw on our national resources. So we're just, you know, one of 10 emergency operations center across BC or across Canada that would deal with disasters or anything like that, where we can draw on expertise from other provinces and bring in and have them support us if they're not effective with their own emergency at the time. So that's part of our planning, is building resiliency behind the scenes for us, and making sure if we're putting people into the heat, that we have enough people to pull them out to cool off, and to make sure that they get into water, cooling stations, things like that, so that they're still able to function throughout the shift. So we will probably add a third of a shift on, just to make sure that our officers can still function.
In terms of that kind of, you've just described effectively a cascade of information where you are effectively training those people who will then take the message to their own particular area. How do you find that that operates across different agencies? Because if you're with the RCMP and you're engaging with firefighters or other emergency medical services or educators, for example, are there any issues or challenges that you face in getting that information over?
For us, we have liaisons built in. So in BC, it's 6 regions of emergency management. We have liaisons built into every basically emergency management piece there. So provincial, regional emergency center. So we'll send liaisons there when anything is happening, and they'll bring our message back. And something like this, we don't hold back information. You know, there's no state secrets here. We're out there to save lives at the end of the day. It's public safety. And our job is to make sure to get information into the hands of people so that they can do the same thing, to go and distribute the message and continue on.
I wasn't thinking so much of it as a resistance to the message as in the case of, is there a risk that things get lost in translation? If you're
100%.
telling somebody, giving a message, who's then passing it on, and it, you know, the best will in the world, it can actually happen. So I was just curious as to whether there's any feedback that you then engage with the final recipient of the information that you've passed forward.
Well, if it's happening in the area, detachment area, so if we're into like we have 250 detachments in BC here. So if it's going to a separate detachment area, we will loop that commander into our overall planning and into our response. So he'll come on to calls twice a day, and he'll be onto a separate call with his region as we're giving instructions to them. Hey, this is what's happening. This is who you have to reach out to. So the message doesn't get diluted because we will reinforce it at all levels as it's moving out of our office.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Now, Sam, wearing kind of 2 hats, if you like, from your new city role and the fact that you've come from the Fire and Rescue Service. In terms of adapting training, my thinking behind that question is, have you needed to adapt any training protocols in order to meet what are becoming more extreme heat emergencies, or is there already resilience built into the system? And if so, what does that training and resilience look like?
It's already built in. Again, you know, we have, like I said, if we're going to reach triple digits, that automatically triggers reminders. You know, every shift in the fire service here in Plano starts out with the deputy chief being online, much like we are right now, with his battalion chiefs. Then the battalion chiefs wind up having the same meeting with all 7 of their stations, each battalion chief, so that they can make sure that, you know, SOP, fill in the blank, is being read. Refresh your memory on it. I think from the medical side of it is where we really have undergone a lot of training. We have a very progressive medical director, and we train for, like, you know, making sure you're keeping your fluids cool. I'm talking about your IV fluid. You know, all of our apparatus are air conditioned, which is a blessing. So every fire truck, every ambulance, everything's air conditioned. Even when it's plugged in at the station, it has like a RVAC unit on it. So, and then obviously we have loggers that would warn us if anything got too hot, something malfunctions, so our drugs don't get ruined. But I think it's more to Peter's point. It's again, it comes back to if this, then that. So if you're going to have those extreme temperatures, the first thing you have to do is add more personnel, because you know the horsepower is just not there. If you come out of a fire, even a minor one, with all that gear on, you know, you're 35-40 pounds heavier. Obviously, all of that thermal insulation to keep the heat from getting to you also does a great job of keeping the heat in you. And so you have to really rotate your resources. So as the battalion chief, for example, you know you're going to have to call for additional resources to be able to relieve those people quicker and let them get to rehab. And the way you're able to make all that work is by adding additional resources, more ambulances on the street. We know it's not a secret. We know there's going to be heat-related emergencies from the public. One of our challenges, I guess you could say, is just the diversity of our topography of the Metroplex. We're pushing almost 8 million of our closest friends living in the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan region. That makes us the 4th most populated region in the United States. And a lot of that, like in Fort Worth, due west of here, about 45, 50 minutes, is a lot of undeveloped land and pockets in between. Livestock, that's something, you know, horses and cattle are very big still here in the state, even in what we call the interface zone between the concrete jungle and agricultural pasture land with livestock grazing. So you have to really take into account, you know, making sure that if water mains break or you're getting tanker water out to these remote areas, not only for the people to have potable water, but for livestock. So again, I think we're really well prepared, just due to the fact that we know it's going to get very hot every year. This was, like I said, just an extraordinarily bad year. And really the key thing that we were the most concerned about was the fragility of our grid, electric grid, because of the population explosion that we've had here. It's just trying to keep up. If anything goes wrong, that resiliency that they had built in, there were some days that we didn't have any left capacity. If anything went wrong, we were going to start having rolling brownouts. Fortunately, it did not. But that's probably our biggest concern is if you lose power, what do you do? And that's where you have to figure out what facilities are capable. Hospitals, again, we were this close to having to evacuate our level 1 trauma center in 21 due to all the electricity going out and their backup generators not working, and the heating system in the hospital not being able to work. And luckily, as we were making preparations for how to get buses and everything that you would need to evacuate a 420 bed hospital with ice all over the ground, which we don't deal with very well down here in the South. So I think the irony is a lot of the preparation and practices that we've put into place for when things go wrong for cold emergencies, it just so happens those same things work in your favor for heat-related emergencies. There's some synergy between that planning that takes place.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I just have to say to the audience, regrettably, I think we've lost Jamie for this session. As I said earlier, he's in rural Nova Scotia, so I think he's got some technical issues. But I am delighted that Chris Case from Chatham County will be rejoining us. And it's fortunate that he's rejoined us because I've got a question for him. And again, it's following up on heat emergencies covering significant geographical areas. Can you tell us a little bit about how you engage wider stakeholder groups from a fire service perspective, including things such as charities, housing groups, private landlords, education providers, in order to make them aware of what to expect in a heat emergency and how best they can prepare to help you?
Thanks, Rid. When I moved to Canada, I was told that I was moving to the banana belt, which was basically the warm bit of Canada, which was a bit of a shock when it was -40 in the winter time. So I can share my good friend Sam's interest with -6, just dreamlike state. We faced this issue with COVID. This was the interesting thing I recall, is when we had a heat dome, I remember, going back to 2020. And it was interesting trying to deal with that in the context that you can't gather people together. So the wider stakeholders then became, you know, where can we put people into church halls, or can we use schools, or this type of thing. So we find that our external stakeholders are just as well informed as us. In fact, to be honest, I find our external stakeholders are much better than we are. We're still very much on the catch up with heat emergencies. But listening to all the discussion, it was that for me was the most interesting aspect of what we had to deal with, was to deal with all those stakeholders when we were trying to offer people refuge, but they had to be in isolation, which puts a whole different spin on what you're trying to do. So in answer to your question, Rid, we have some really good networks in terms of the Emergency Operations Centre. We haven't yet declared an emergency due to a heat issue, but we find that people are very well informed locally, and it's not something that I've had to deal with just yet.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The next question, I think we've touched on already in some of the responses that you've given, but I'll ask it anyway because I'm interested if you can kind of amplify some of the answers they've been given, because obviously they will be of interest to not just myself but to the wider audience. It's how do you build in operational resilience into your personnel? Given the fact that you are dealing, we've spoken about this afternoon already, we are dealing with human beings who have an inbuilt fragility around things such as heat. So if you're expecting somebody to be operational in extremes of heat, how are you dealing with that in terms of enabling a continuity of response? So Sam, you touched on some of the things which I was fascinated to hear about in terms of having large bodies of water with ice and cloths already available for firefighters as they're coming away from particular emergency situations. But is there a general approach? Are there general lines of guidance and advice that you can offer? Or are there quite unique things to your own particular geographical areas and experiences?
I would say just, again, going on the 15 to 20 minute rule, that's the max that someone stays engaged in heavy physical activity before going to a mandatory rehab. We have pop-up tents that we'll throw up real quick, like you'd see at a ball game tailgating, provide them shade, get them a literally ice cold wet towel over their head, get their gear off of them. We take their vitals to make sure we have parameters. If their vitals of pulse or blood pressure is above X, then they have to stay in rehab longer. It's cliche, we all say it, but the most important resource is the human resource. We have to take care of our personnel. And again, you don't let it sneak up on you. You have to, the forecast is not a secret. So you're going to have to hire back additional personnel, stand up additional equipment. And to my point I was making earlier, we are so diverse in 8 million people here, and I can't even begin to name the number of municipalities, and we're very parochial. We all want our own fire department, our own police department. We don't do big amalgamations here like you would see in other parts of the world. And so when we're in a bad situation, so is all of our partners. So it's difficult to really help one another. You do the best you can, but if something massive is affecting Dallas and Plano, it's also affecting Fort Worth and vice versa. So I think it's just really, we have mandatory physical fitness standards to remain in operations with both police department and fire department. So you have to make sure you're keeping your body in fine condition, just like an athlete would be able to, has to do to stay on the field longer. Just good physical conditioning, making sure that we have plenty of water and electrolytes, Gatorade, things like that we distribute at all of our stations, and making sure it's on the trucks. Like I said, it's the way you rehab is, oxygenation, cooling, and liquids, and follow that regime and just keep doing it until it finally abates, and making sure that people get the appropriate rest.
Thank you very much. Peter, does that resonate with you in terms of the approach that you're seeing more and more?
We might not see the same physicality, but we do have the mental challenges. During the last heat dome here, our officers were at scenes waiting 6-7 hours for a coroner or for an ambulance to show up. So for us, it's, their mental health and their wellness at the end of the day is, making sure they're okay when they come out of a scene, or relieving them at a scene, putting someone else in while we wait for a body removal service, something like that. So that for us was the biggest challenge. It's not about cooling and things like that. Sam is right. We have plenty of warning. Our cars are air conditioning, we put water in, things like that. But it's going to the calls where we're dealing with a significant amount of death, where our guys are in there and looking, and they have to treat it as a crime scene first. And that's the first step. Is it due to the heat emergency, or is it due to some other kind of trauma? And you know what, that takes a toll physically and mentally. And for us, it's making sure these guys, when they come out, they get the proper debrief, and get them into, hey, are you okay, or do we have to send you home? Because it's just not the visual. There's a lot of other things that come with being on a scene, physical things that come to your senses. So those are some of the challenges that we have to deal with there.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Peter. Chris, would you be able to give almost a comparison between some of the things you experienced within the UK, which as a temperate climate, which stays relatively stable, to what you've experienced since moving to Canada? But now we could take heat in terms of extreme of upper thermometer heat or lower thermometers, where you're dealing with temperatures in well below Celsius 0.
I think the one thing we've seen, especially in the past few years in the UK, is that heat has become an issue that it's never been before. The example I was going to give was earlier this year. We didn't exactly have a heat emergency, but you've got a heat is a constant to a certain extent. So we've got a level of heat in the community, and then we had a tornado come through quite a large portion of the municipality, which cuts out everybody's power, everybody's hydro. So then suddenly you've got the emergency of the tornadoes, and that can be quite localized. But you've then got the bigger emergency that heat is beginning to build, and it might not be something we were ready for because we weren't given a heat alert. But you've got to start working with your hydro providers, your electricity providers, then by saying, well, how long do you think it will be? And as both my colleagues will say, asking an electricity provider to give an estimate of when the hydro is going to come back on is not an easy thing. You know, it's like asking a doctor what your chances are. Well, you know, it could be 8 hours, it could be 8 days. It's difficult for them to give that answer. So you've got to start planning for a heat emergency in the middle of an existing emergency. So it's always good to have that interoperability. To go back to our previous session, it's always good to have those connections so that at least when all the power goes down, your partners in the power company are thinking, well, this is going to have a knock on. We're going to start seeing EMS are now suddenly going to become very busy in 12 to 15 hours, or we might start seeing that water pressures drop. So there's always that additional aspect that we have to put on. Even if heat isn't the first issue, it can always become the secondary or even the tertiary issue.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, coming up to the final question, and it's about lessons learned. It's a phrase that's been mentioned already in the discussion, but it's building upon an existing body of knowledge so that you're better prepared for the next time. So I know you've articulated that you've had quite a lot of experience in dealing with heat emergencies over the last number of years, where the temperature has been increasing more and more. But how have you seen lessons learned being captured and then disseminated across not just the immediate emergency services, but across the wider stakeholder groups?
With any significant event, we do incident action plan reviews. And so that's coordinated through our emergency management office. So PD will capture all of the challenges that they faced and what they did to overcome them and what their future needs would be to not let that happen again. Fire does the same thing in EMS. Our TPW, our streets, our water supply, all of these things, Parks Rec, all the departments that are involved write up, and then it goes into the general document that gets kind of spoken in one voice and cleaned up a little bit by our emergency management, and then we disseminate that. Oftentimes it's getting all the department heads and assistant department heads together for a review of the document at the end of the day, and have that face-to-face discussion. So I think in the fire service we're extremely good at what we call hot washes, where it may just involve the battalion commander and the 4 or 5 companies that were on the incident with him, and you talk about it right there about what you need or what you can do better. But large scale events like Winter Storm Uri in 21, that was one that, not only did we have the plan, the State Fire Chiefs Association, we shared all of our plans to see what particular challenges maybe were a little bit different for Charles Hood down in San Antonio versus the Dallas fire chief or what have you. So I think it's just a matter of you capture those things and you purposefully have a structured incident action plan that you fill out, and then it gets shared amongst everybody. And every time you're going to learn something different. I mean, like I said, things that the cascading effect is always what concerns me is, not where we are right now. Where are we headed? What's the next bad thing? If this happens, what are we going to do? And what we figured out quickly is electricity is prime for everything. It all revolves around the electric grid. And then secondary is water supply, whether it be in the summer or the winter. Those are your 2 critical elements that you really have to make sure you're prepared for, stockpiling, things of that nature.
Thank you very much for that. Peter, does that resonate with you in terms of the opportunity to input into a lessons learned action plan that comes out of an incident and therefore take things back?
Absolutely. We have a after action report for every major incident that we have. But what's really happened in the province here is they've deemed a new position at a minister level. There's a minister of emergency management now. That's been new since 2021, you know, not just for the heat, but that was like the trifecta. You had the wildfires, you had the atmospheric river flooding, you had the heat dome. So at the end of the day, there's a new ministry, there's a new focus on what's happening here. And what I've seen is there's more groups getting together, the interoperability of it, and they're discussing more, they're meeting more, and they're putting the plans on the table of what they need. And, you know, I heard a lot about silos earlier on. This is where the silos are broken down, is at that table. You sit and you discuss with the people that actually make decisions and develop policies and legislation that can help people moving forward. And I think from my position in my seat, being a voice that can make change, that's where I've seen the best change happen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Chris, from a fire chief's perspective, what would you like to add to that?
I can't add anything to my two colleagues, but the one thing I would say is I've found in discussions around anything to do with climate, there's always an aspect of a political, you know, climate denier. There's that real perception, you know, number of times where people have jokingly said to me, it's what we call summer, you know, that whole dismissive thing. And that can't be ignored because we're really in the business of trying to make the community be more risk perceptive. We're really trying to make the community understand that they have to be prepared and that these things might happen. So not much we can do about it right now, but it's interesting for me that whenever I've listened to any kind of debriefs about heat emergencies or snow emergencies, this whole political debate about climate change and that seems to come in from the side. And I just think as leaders, it's something we should be aware of, but it's something we should be ready to deal with in a very clear and non-partisan way.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Again, coming back to the most recent experience we've had with heat emergencies within the UK, we're now starting to look at the ways in which lessons that have been learned in other countries can now start to be brought into the British psyche, if that's a good way to place it. Because, as I said in my preamble, the culture within the United Kingdom is if the weather gets hot and sunny, then that's a really, really good thing. And the hotter it gets, the more people enjoy it. But of course, the negative impacts of prolonged heat over a long period of time, it's not something we've seen very much of. So we don't know how to respond to it. We don't have the opportunities in many cases to utilize air conditioning, for example. So we are starting to learn how to deal with the housing stock that we have, which is designed to keep the heat in rather than keep the heat out, and therefore take actions on very much a local level. And it's education, and that's the position that we're in at the moment, is to try and take lessons learned from people such as yourselves and from other countries, particularly Australia, as to how we can deal with the impact of heat on things like existing housing stock, the way in which cities are structured, and the way in which parks and recreational environments are made available to people more and more. So it's becoming far more of a discussion point within the United Kingdom. In terms of the questions that I had pre-prepared, I've come to the end of those. So thank you very much for your input into those. I suppose at this point within the presentation, we've got the opportunity to look at some of the questions which are coming up in the Q&A. I'm just going to work to the front. We've got Laura's jumped in to save me making myself look even more foolish than I normally do.
I will help with the question period.
Thank you very much.
Great job. Thank you. So we have a good question that's come up here, probably one everyone might want to comment on. So the most vulnerable, the unhoused, language barriers, rural seniors, gender, etc., may not have access to technology and social media to be told when and where to access help and assistance. Are there programs, resources, supports available to take proactive steps to access training to ensure safety, EM communication and supports is not shifted solely to them to address on their own? And who would like to answer that one first?
I'll go first.
All right, Sam.
We have and this is becoming quite popular throughout the Metroplex and probably the nation for that matter, but we have community paramedics that are very active, and they pair up with our neighborhood services department as well as our police mental health officials, and they go into the camps where we know we have homeless folks, to actually proactively make sure that their needs are being met the best we can. Let them know what shelters are available. Candidly, a lot of folks, even they don't want to go to a shelter because there are rules at a shelter. And so we have to really look after those people. That same program has been stood up for 4 years now. Ironically, my son's the lieutenant in Fort Worth Fire Department that heads up their HOPE team. And it's a triad of the mental health experts in PD and the fire department going into the known homeless camps or areas that they know they congregate, and making sure that they're getting basic medical needs and sanitary needs and things of that nature. So you have to really make the effort. What I will tell you down here, it's been our experience that the one thing that they usually will have, even when they're homeless, is they will have a prepaid phone. Their ability to communicate amongst themselves is actually much better than what I had actually anticipated.
Interesting. Peter, what do you think?
At the end of the day, we have a lot of outreach, but when the heat dome hits, what we see is a lot of emergent volunteer groups going out and looking after their own. A bottle of water goes a long way. You know, having a conversation and just checking in gives them their dignity back in this disaster time period. And that's what we've seen is, you know what, we're not going out as police officers anymore. We're going out as, hey, how are you doing? Here's a bottle of water. What can we do for you? We become, our roles become the person of a support person for them, because at the end of the day, who else is going to do it? And what we're finding is a lot of the volunteer groups, the NGOs, are doing the same thing. So that's where we, a lot of times, will partner up with groups within our communities and things like that, have the discussions. You know, if they have a rapport with the groups or the communities that they're in there, the vulnerable groups or communities, then you know what, this is what we're asking them to do. And that's the best we can do, because as Sam said, a lot of these people don't want to go to a shelter because of the rules, or they don't feel secure.
Very good point. And Chris?
Chris?
Well, this is probably one of the best questions that we've heard this afternoon. And I think it comes to the root of a problem that we face probably in emergency management and fire. And that is that everything focuses around public education, this strange concept that you can somehow educate the public not to get into trouble. It's absolute nonsense. The only way that you can care for especially vulnerable members of the community is exactly as Peter and Sam have said, it's about partnerships and it's about community engagement. It's about community safety. And if you've got that framework in place, then the emergency is almost immaterial. It's about protecting vulnerable people with a framework that can adapt for any kind of emergency, because the same people who are at risk with heat, we have exactly the same issues here with flooding. We've had to adapt with our community paramedics and NGOs driving down the riverbank in the event that the water is about to rise, because we can educate everybody, you know, we can tell everybody to move away, but that's where somebody lives. So then you've got to have that conversation to say you need to move away from the river. So I have a bit of a soapbox when it comes to public education. You know, it's as if you can give everybody the same message and everybody gets the same level of protection. Absolute nonsense. And it's only by having that network of partners who can deal with very specific aspects of vulnerability that you can reach the people who need it most with the most help.
Oh, absolutely. Ridian, do you have anything you want to add to this question?
Not really. I can't really add much onto what Chris has already said. It's not my area of expertise in terms of community outreach, so I think I wouldn't add anything to it for fear of muddying the waters. But an excellent question and something for us to learn a lot from.
Yeah, I agree. An excellent question indeed. And we've got our audience has gotten shy at this late hour in the day, so we can probably wrap on that question. And I'm going to say thank you to Ridian. Thank you for moderating. You did an excellent job. And thank you, Peter and Chris and Sam, for joining us and sharing your thoughts on this subject. There's just so much to tackle in this interoperability realm. And it's been great hearing from everybody today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brittany to sign us all off here.
Thank you very much, all, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Laura. I just want to build on that and say, on behalf of Blue Line, Firefighting in Canada, and Avert Magazines, a big thank you to our experts for volunteering their time and their insights today from all three sessions. So thank you guys again. I'd also like to thank our sponsor of today's event, Axon. And I'd also like to thank our audience for tuning in today. We know that it's been it's always a busy time for those of you working in public safety, and we appreciate you choosing to spend part of your day with us. We are passionate about helping officers, firefighters, emergency managers, and EMS do their jobs and providing relevant content to help you do that in the best way possible. Once again, I'm Brittany Schroeder, and until next time, stay safe and be well.